Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. This one is one I'm sure a lot of people are very excited about. It's been kind of getting a little bit of buzz on Twitter and online, which is amazing and great to see. And thanks everyone. So today is Battle of the Scheldt. We're going to be taking obviously a Canadian focus, but we're going to be talking about it at large. And we have a really great guest on today who I'm really proud to have and glad on the channel. So we've got Mark Zuehlke joining us, who wrote a great book on this and the campaigns before and after and everything. We're going to get talking about a whole bunch of different stuff. So it's great to have him on. Thanks for joining us, Mark. Really appreciate you coming on today.
Glad to be here, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And we've been organizing this for a while, so it's getting me pretty excited. And you sent me the slideshow, so we've got some maps and some different photos, but we're just going to be kind of talking about different things. And of course, people watching, if you have questions or there's something you want us to talk more about, and that's kind of a directed question to, I think, one of you who you know I'm talking about out there watching today, just fire away and we will do what we can. So like how I like to start most of these live streams is kind of asking how you got into this specific topic. Like in your book, which I got to go through, is you mentioned this stuff and kind of how you got here. So I didn't wonder if you just sort of tell everybody real quick about how we got here.
Yeah, so I've done a book. I've done a number of books before this on the called the Canadian Battle Series about the Canadian Army in World War II, and I did a book on D-Day called Juno Beach, which was supposed to have been from June 6th to June 12th, but it very quickly became clear that June 6th was going to eat up the allowable word count. So Juno Beach was then, so it was then followed by Holding Juno, which then took the June 7th to June 12th part of the campaign. And when that ended, you would think the most logical thing would then to have gone to the breakout campaign for a book. But I was looking around, and one of the things that occurred to me as I was doing research was that the Battle of the Scheldt that the Canadians were involved in later was this really major, important battle that had been largely swept aside, put in a closet and forgotten about. And that kind of thing bothers me always when I was looking at that. And I thought, well, you never know how many more books, you can't just guarantee a publisher is going to say, oh, go and do another book, go and do another book, go and do another book. Right. It's a little better these days, but and so I thought, well, I'm not just going to be constrained by chronology. I'm going to look at where I think the subjects really need to be told. And I really thought the Scheldt Estuary, the more I dug into it, was this incredible story. The massive campaign by 1st Canadian Army, really the first time that 1st Canadian Army fights in where they're all fighting all the time. For all, basically a month. And it's a remarkable story. And so I thought, well, okay, that's going to be the book. I'm going to do this and I called it Terrible Victory because it was really, the cost was huge. And arguably the campaign did not have to be fought the way it was because of Antwerp having fallen so much earlier, and so then yes, we won the battle, but at a terrible cost. So it was a terrible victory was my thinking there.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect way to put this, that it is a terrible victory, and we'll talk about the development of why things went the way they did, but it's a great way to think about it in that sense of, yes, it's a victory, but the stakes and what it took to get there, like you lay out in the book, we can talk about that, but I do want to talk about how we can literally the 1st Canadian Army got to this point, but we can talk about that in a bit, but how that develops, what the strategy is. There's controversy here. There's controversial people involved that everybody loves to talk about, so I'm sure that's going to come up. And there's lots of questions already starting to pour in, so it's great. So we'll get started. So anyway, so I do want to talk about, you said you didn't do the breakout, which those of you who are familiar with Mark's work know that. But there's a bigger breakout, I guess is the way to put it, right? We've got a map here showing basically what it is. If the technology would cooperate with me for a second here.
Yeah.
So talking about once they push basically past the Seine and what that looks like. I was wondering if you could just kind of get us to the Scheldt.
Yeah, so this is actually the topic of another book of mine now called Cinderella Campaign, which is about the clearing of the Channel ports. And so if you're looking at that map, the darker, bold black arrows are 1st Canadian Army, and the other arrows are the British and American units to the right of the Canadians. So when we came out of Normandy, and some people say this is by design, but it was really more by happenstance, because the Canadians had been closing the Falaise Gap. And so when that put us to the left of the rest of the Allied army. And so nobody's going to reorganize at that point. So the 1st Canadian Army gets the long left flank, as it's often been called, and that's their line of advance. And that put them on line to go up into the Channel port country. And those ports are deemed as being important to be cleared, and with an idea of opening them up to Allied shipping. So that at this point, everything that's coming in the way of Allied supplies is coming in at Normandy. It then has to be trucked up to wherever the advanced head of the ever advancing head of the Allied army is. So that's extremely costly. They were burning, it was like a 3-to-1 ratio. It took three gallons of gas to get 1 gallon of gas to the front lines. That's not sustainable in the long term. And so they wanted to clear the ports, open them up, start bringing supplies in. Hitler realized this as well, so he had designated the ports as fortresses. So Calais, Dunkirk, Boulogne, and Dieppe and Le Havre are all turned into fortresses. Now, Dieppe fell quickly and easily because the word that it was being turned into a fortress didn't reach the fortress commander, and he bunked out with his troops. And basically the Germans were retreating past him, and he said, "We'll just join them." And then they were gone. And so then Dieppe falls really without a shot being fired, and very fortunately, because the Kruger, the Canadian general, had actually arranged for Dieppe to be heavily bombed in preparation for that. So those of you who've been to Dieppe, and it's a very pretty little city, it would have been blown off the face of the earth in the bombing raids that were planned to hit it. So it was spared. 2nd Division is allowed to go in, and 2nd Division goes in and are the liberators, because of course they had been the ones that had been defeated in the August 1942 raid on Dieppe. So we're looking at 1st Canadian Army being very involved into the early part of September, trying to clear these Channel ports. This was not an easy job. It had, each of them had to be approached in a kind of siege mentality, with lots of heavy weapons, heavy equipment, specialized equipment of the British Armored Division that made the funnies. So the flails, the wasps, all that stuff that we were familiar with, or a lot of us would be familiar with in the way of special technology, in order to break in to these fortresses and then take out the defenders. So it was a long and slow process. Each one had to be done in turn, because you had to bring the funnies from Le Havre up to Boulogne to start that one. Then when Boulogne falls, you have to take the funnies and move them to Calais. So it's slow and painful and pretty costly to make this happen. There's not a lot of glamour in the Cinderella Campaign. And it was I called it the Cinderella Campaign because we were also at the short stick of the supply routes. The American and British armies were being supplied first, and then the leftovers were tossed over to the Canadians, because the Americans and British, of course, are advancing quite rapidly. And understandably, Schaeff doesn't want to slow that process down.
Right.
Let's keep them rolling, because everyone's got it in their head that the war is going to be over by Christmas at this point. Montgomery's saying it, Patton's saying it, Bradley's saying it. The only one who isn't saying it is Kruger, of the First Canadian Army. And I think that was because he was a little more realistic. He's looking at what's happening on his front, and we're not making a lot of progress.
No.
And partly that too. That's a matter of geography. If you look at the geography of the French coast, it's much more mountainous than the interior. It's almost the opposite of what you would think. Normally, as you head down towards coasts, they decline in altitude. In France, it rises in altitude as effectively as almost you're heading towards the White Cliffs of Dover on the British side. You're heading towards White Cliffs on the French side as well.
Yeah, exactly. I've done some. There's some footage on my channel of the taking of Boulogne and of Calais. So, and again, you can see this terrain. It's not what you would think it looks like. I mean, Cape Grenade, with those big coastal batteries are, which cause problems for Dover, are part of this, and that's a tough fight to get those, to take, and it's not an easy fight by any means.
Well, and there were a few of those batteries that they were actually able to swivel. A lot of them were fixed and pointed towards England, couldn't be turned, but some of them they did get turned around, and they were tossing out a pretty heavy shell towards the Canadians as they're approaching. So that's what we face. And then as Antwerp falls on September 2nd, I believe, then there becomes pressure to move Canadian troops up there to take the pressure off of the British troops that are in Antwerp, because they need to be released to go and participate in Operation Market Garden. So we start seeing Canadian troops pulled away from the Channel ports, rushed up to Antwerp. They get to Antwerp, and to really simplify the process, everyone says, whoops, we've got Antwerp, but we don't have the Scheldt Estuary. And so the port's useless to us until the estuary is cleared. The backstory on that, of course, is that Montgomery made that calculated decision because he could either open up the Scheldt Estuary with the troops he had that arrived in Antwerp, or he could draw them off and have Operation Market Garden. He couldn't have both. Right. It was one or the other decision. And he firmly believes that Market Garden is not only going to secede, but it's going to win the war. They're just going to punch right through, and you'll have the war over by Christmas thing again. As we know, that doesn't happen. Market Garden fails in its ultimate objective. And by the time Market Garden fails, the Germans have woke up to the situation and the threat at the Scheldt Estuary. And instead of retreating from there, they pour resources into the Scheldt Estuary country and prepare to defend it to the last bullet if they can, because they know Antwerp is in good shape. We can start bringing ships in there anytime. So if we could come down the Scheldt Estuary with our freighters, we're good to go. So the Germans are determined to stop that. Yeah,
and that's the key point there, I think you said, is that the port facilities, it's not even a harbor, because the port facilities in Antwerp are still to this day massive. They're going forever, seemingly.
And they were pretty much the same size as what you see today.
Yeah, it's crazy how much there is. But anyway, so I just wanted to go back a quick second, because I think we were chatting about this before. Some of this stuff is going to be unavoidable, but I think it's a fair assessment. Is a question from Norma, who's always is one of my biggest fans. Again, thanks for the support, Norma. But about Horcrux and his, I don't know. There's the question there. I mean, the lack of not taking that opportunity. I was wondering if you could just briefly talk about that.
It's a very interesting point, and Horrocks himself lamented in his own his autobiography not having done that. So there was two things. A, he was under orders by Montgomery to just stop at Antwerp, and there was a lack of intel, I think, on that part when you look at it was an underappreciation of just how big the Antwerp port was. The British tended to think that it was the port facilities in front of Antwerp.
Right.
But if you go over to the east, the really major port is to the east and the northeast around a place called Merksem. And they didn't appreciate the importance of getting those ports. And you had to do that, you had to capture a series of bridges, about 3 bridges, if I remember right, to get into there. And when the British arrived, the Dutch and Belgian, I should say the Belgian resistance, was in the ground. They were fighting for control of the main bridge, and they actually requested the British to come forward, because if the British had brought up their tanks, they could have won the battle right there on the bridge. Right. And the general and the actual commander of that British division, the British had an attitude I should bring in. They didn't trust the Belgian resistance movement because of its divisions. It was a very fragmented resistance movement. There was the loyalists to the monarchy. There was a really strong communist group. There was another group that were more Republicans, and everyone was looking at how they wanted to shape post-war Belgium, but at the same time fighting the Germans. And the British looked at this and didn't trust a lot of the information they were getting from the intelligence from the resistance movements. So they don't respond to this. They don't go in and try and take that bridge. They instead stand down. We've achieved our objective. Let's all have a cup of tea. And that's kind of literally some of the things you see in the war diary entries around this. By the time Horrocks arrives at the scene, he realizes that the opportunity has passed. The Germans are starting to, again, anchor their defenses down around Merksem and rushing troops in to keep control of those ports. Interestingly, they don't cause an enormous amount of damage to that port area, and when we do get all of Antwerp, a lot of those port facilities are still good to go. Why that? I think that was a lack of work. They didn't have time, they didn't have the resources to effectively do that. They could fight the Allies, or they could try and damage the ports. They couldn't do both.
Right.
So that's where we're at. And then, of course, they're pulled away. The British head off to become the lead in Operation Market Garden, because Horrocks commands 30th British Corps. And they're the ones who are going to go up and relieve each of the paratroop divisions as they advance to Arnhem. So, that moment's lost. And now everyone realizes there's going to be a long and hard campaign to open up the Scheldt Estuary. And, we see Eisenhower and Montgomery constantly saying, "Can't you move faster?" But even they both realize you can't. They can't. Although Monty in his memoir says, "I thought the Canadians could do the job more quickly. I was wrong," which is sort of faint praise for the Canadians.
Yeah, that's crazy. You're going to get from Monty and a written record anyway. Yeah, but so it's interesting. I mean, people are commenting here about a few things, like at certain points, the 11th Division, hold on, where is it here? 11th Armored is running thin. It is by this point. So that is part of the issue. But I mean, that can't be ignored, right? We can't just say, just go out there. And there is the issues of holding the port. But like you said, the Germans are stretched thin, but they don't know that. So they can only do one or the other, basically, like you said, fight or take out the port, and they can't do both. Also, which I think is really interesting, that I want to come to later, but I don't want to forget, is which I think is an interesting part to me is the the streetcar war, or the streetcar stuff that you talk about in your book. I think that's really interesting. But I do want to go past that. So now we've kind of set the the stage, or sort of set the scene here of what's going on. So I want to know if we can kind of just move forward and talk about kind of how you start the book. And I think it's a really good way of doing it, because Sorry, hold on. My computer's fighting me here again. To me, it's a super interesting way to think about it, and it's the fighting at the Leopold Canal.
That's right.
Which is an important part of all of this.
Yeah, so there was two attempts to bounce the Leopold Canal. The first one is by the Algonquin Regiment of 4th Armored Division, and that happens quite early, within just a couple days after Antwerp has been taken. They arrive at the Leopold Canal at a spot where the canal is actually two canals, one running inland and one running out towards the sea, and they have to cross both of them in order to get to the other side. And the Algonquins do this with assault boats. They paddle across the Derivision de Lys, as it's called. My French is terrible. And they crawl up over the big dike in between, and then try and launch across the actual Leopold Canal to reach the other side. And they do, but they're so badly shot up by that time that they can't possibly continue. And that attack fails. Again, an intelligence error in the belief that the Germans were running. If they could establish a bridgehead across there, that we would break into the Breskens area and then get to the south side of the Scheldt Estuary really quickly, with 4th Armored Division having its a strong armored component that could make its way to the south bank of the Scheldt River. Again, if you know that country and the polders, the idea that you could race tanks across that countryside and get to the South Scheldt was probably not a realistic vision of how things were going to go, because your only way of traveling was along the dikes, roads that are on dikes, that the Germans can easily cover with a couple 75 millimeter anti-tank guns.
And which they did.
So we have our first failure of what's going to be quite a lot of failed assaults that then have to be repeated and repeated and repeated until finally you win. And really that's what we see on October 6th, October 13th here, where 3rd Division, having finally managed to complete taking Calais, races up here with orders to get moving into the Breskens pocket and clear that and get that south bank of the Scheldt open. And there they were, they had to get across. They used wasps this time with the flamethrowers, but a lot of the flames ended up falling short. The range was too far. And they landed in the water and was posed more of a hazard to the Canadians crossing than it did to the Germans. The Germans by this time have really fortified the canal. They've dug a lot of pillboxes and right into the banks. They've got machine guns, particularly more MG42s than anti-tank weaponry. A lot of mortars standing back from there. And so they're able to, basically hold the Canadians just across the canal. And that situation remains static until October 13th. And the only reason it breaks at that point is because of Operation Switchback, which has happened where we come in behind them from the crossing over and getting into Hoofdblad. And
and I think, sorry, I think this is a good comment from Alex here. It's a feint, but it doesn't succeed in what it's supposed to do until the main operation is successful.
Well, it's also actually, it was supposed to open it up. The original idea on this attack was that 9th Brigade would come in behind the 7th Brigade and push out from there. Very quickly, by October 7th, they've realized this isn't going to happen. And so they leave 7th Brigade in place.
Oh, that's true, right.
And swing 9th Brigade over to Turnhusen to then launch Operation Switchback, which is put together really fast. You know, if you
Yeah.
look at the planning documents on that, it shows First Canadian Army at its fastest and most adaptive ability. You know, they bring forward the buffaloes. They organize that. They train 9th Brigade down by Ghent in use of buffaloes, which they've never done. In like a day or two of crazy, and then they actually just run the buffaloes up the canal to Terneuzen and are ready to launch Operation Switchback. So it's pretty amazing, actually, how quickly that comes together. Of course, it's not First Canadian Army operating on its own. They're working with the British who operate the buffaloes and the other guys that I can't remember the name of right now. And the British Navy is throwing in resources as well to help with this, to get this operation going. But it's a pretty amazing piece of work.
Yeah, and it really is. And I wanted to step back again with bringing in another map that I think is another good one. But I want to talk about, again, kind of doing the bigger picture here, is the plan for how that the Scheldt is going to be taken. Because I think you do a great job. I just want to say again, in your book, you blend the personal stories with the overall strategy very well in terms of that's engaging, but it also brings it into a new way. And again, there's so many big characters here, like we've already talked about, big personalities and everything. I wonder if we can just kind of talk about the plan overall and the changes, because Kriar is there and he's not. And then everyone's favorite to talk about in the Canadian Army, Simmons, comes in. And I just wonder if you can kind of give us an overview of how that all goes.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, the change in command for 1st Canadian Army. So Harry Kriar becomes ill. It's still a little unclear what his illness was. It seems like it was probably jaundice, but it also could have been a simply or partially exhaustion. Kriar was not a young man. He had been commanding through Normandy and up the coast, and there's a lot of pressure there. Yeah. So, I think it was a combination of jaundice and stress, anxiety. Lieutenant General Guy Simmons now takes, as commander of 2nd Canadian Corps, is the second person in the hierarchy. He takes command to Montgomery. This is the greatest news he's been waiting for. Montgomery hated Kriar, and Kriar hated Montgomery, so it was a very mutual situation.
Oh yeah, that is definitely not a secret by any means at the time.
It's pretty evident.
I've been through Kriar's papers for my dissertation, which is about Hong Kong, and obviously he's a big player in that. But I was going through the later stuff, trying to figure some stuff out, and I mean, it just comes up in the strangest places. Well, after the war, he's still mad, which I think. Oh
yeah.
See that in Kriar doing other things, but he's still pissed at Montgomery.
Yeah, there's no love lost between these men. Yeah. Simmons is another story entirely. Montgomery had viewed Simmons as a protege. Simmons views himself as having been mentored by Montgomery. Mm-hmm. He took to wearing the black beret, Simmons, as part of it. Mm-hmm. And I just saw Alexander Fitz Black's saying Guy's finest hour, and I agree. Actually, he handles the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary extremely well. He rises to the occasion, shows that he can do not just a corps command, but is a very capable army commander. That's, I think, an important thing to realize with this battle, because he does pretty much have free will. Montgomery is not paying attention to what's going on in the Scheldt Estuary. So it's up to Simmons to do the job. And what you do see is it still has a kind of piecemeal way of developing because of how the Canadians are arriving on the ground. Each division arrives independently. 4th Armored Division initially arrives up by the Breskens Pocket. They then have to be swung around over to the east side of Antwerp. 2nd Division, as we mentioned, is in Antwerp. It arrives earliest of all of them in Antwerp and is doing the streetcar war, where literally they would come out of their barracks and jump onto streetcars and go up to the coast because they weren't really offensively operating at that time. It was a
Right.
defensive action at that point. But we move over in the early part of really the last few days of September, the early part of October. 2nd Division and 4th Armored Division start to go on the offensive out of Merksem, moving up towards Wandsdrecht, and with the idea of getting into what's known as the Beloland Peninsula, which runs over to Walcheren. And that's to clear off the north side of the Scheldt Estuary. The countryside there is very well suited to defense. It's a little it's quite different than a lot of other parts. Well, actually, most of the rest of the parts of the Netherlands. It's there's a lot of forest there. There's a lot of kind of rugged terrain, particularly where 4th Armored Division is operating. They're starting to get into the Brabant Heights country, and that's quite elevated. And so it gives the Germans good operational ground for putting up a defense. It gives the Canadians a heck of a lot of problems in trying to fight their way through these areas. Plus, you have Battle Group Chill arrives under command.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, can you kind of give us an explanation of what the 1st Canadian Army is facing? Because they're it's kind of complicated a little bit.
Yeah, well, it all is. That's the thing about the Scheldt Estuary campaign. I think
complicated campaign. Yeah.
It's so complicated that Colonel C.P. Stacey, in his official history, if you look at it, he kind of gives up on 4th Canadian Armored Division. It's like his page count was getting too long, and so 4th Canadian Armored Division gets kind of passing mention, but not a whole lot. It's sort of like, okay, well, they were there, they were doing good things, but we don't have time to go there. And that was which was one of the things that when I was doing the book, I you kind of everyone, I think we all use Stacey as our kind of template to remind us of what it is that it needs to be covered. And I get to 4th Canadian Armored Division, I'm thinking, well, what happens to these guys? So then you really have to go back and dig and find out, well, what were they actually doing in their advance towards Bergen-op-Zoom? And one of the things they're doing is they've run head on, as have 2nd Division at Wandsdrecht, into Battle Group Chill, which is a German unit. The Germans were very good at forming these basically fire brigades. You take you just reach out and grab anything that's available, especially if they're elites like paratroopers. And that's what they did. They grabbed a lot of paratroop troops, and I sent you a photo of one of some of the Battle Group Chill guys, and you look at the Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks and the MG-42s that they're packing. These guys are formidable. They are strong. They're determined. Some of them are fanatics, but mostly they're just really well trained, really determined troops. And Chill is himself a very good commander. He's paratroop. He's got a very good tactical sense, and he knows when to give ground and he knows when not to give ground. And he just keeps trying to turn everything he can. That's the photo, into a killing ground. And that Sherman tank there didn't do well. And you look at the weight of weaponry that these guys are packing. And also just, I love this photo actually, because these guys look pretty rugged,
They look like they're seen quite a bit.
Yeah. And they were real veterans. Most of them had fought in the Russian front and are now fighting in the Western front, and they know what they're doing. And I think that's an important point to always keep in mind is we were still learning. The Canadians are still learning, the British are still learning, and the Americans are still learning. In a lot of cases, these troops, particularly the ones that had seen action in the Russian front, they've got a pretty good idea about what they're about. Their morale is fairly high. There's Dutch writer who's written a book about battle group chill in Dutch, unfortunately. It's very, it really gives a good breakdown on how good these guys were and the way they fought against the Canadians, particularly in this operation. And so, what we see at Von Strecht and then even towards in the Woest Plantage, which was the big force that the 4th Division had to fight their way through. Woest Plantage, lots of very dense trees. It's a managed forest. It's so the trees are all spaced a certain way for future logging. The roads that go up through it are really designed for carts to be hauling out trees as they're logged. So they're not exactly ideal for running tanks up. So we end up, there's no room for the tanks to maneuver. They just have to form lines and roll along these roads heading towards Bergen-op-Zoom. And you can't, it's very easy for the Germans to pick off the one in the front, pick off the one behind, and then you can clean up what's in the middle. And that happens in a couple incidences in the Woest Plantage. So it's a very hard fight. We see the Black Watch. They do an advance across an open field towards the railway station at Woensdrecht to try and get into the Beveland Peninsula.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the map here. There we go.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so you can see there. October 16th is really sort of where the Black Watch go in. I think it's the 16th. And
yeah, the 16th, yeah.
And so that railway, which you can see, if you see a place called Kordoven and then come west from that, that railroad is where the Germans, it's a raised railway again. They set up machine gun positions and mortar positions and anti-tank gun positions behind that railway. The Black Watch attack into that, literally walking through a muddy open field in World War I kind of deployment, and are slaughtered in what they deem as Bloody Friday. And they take huge losses. So the Black Watch, that's one of their big major setbacks. They've already been shot to pieces at Verrier Ridge. What we see after that is with the Black Watch is they never really recover from this attack because they lost most of their command structure at Verrier Ridge. They lose a whole bunch more here, and a lot of their veterans are now gone. In fact, most of their veterans are gone. So we see the Black Watch struggle ever after that to be effective. And then we turn around and throw them into the causeway.
You don't get your break,
yeah, we've got a battalion that has been shot to pieces twice in the last 2 months. So let's shoot them to pieces again.
Yeah, do it again.
Which is another thing that happens when you start looking at extended campaigns is you run into these manpower shortages and you have nothing left to work with, and so you take what's already a badly battered battalion and you huck them back in because you don't have anyone else, and that comes up again and again in the Scheldt Estuary.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say, just to jump in there for a second, is your book talked about that, and I think in a great way, and you use the sources that historians would use, right? Personal recollections, but the war diaries and stuff. But again, the quotes from the people on the ground, I think, are the striking part to me of the book, and probably one of the parts I enjoyed the most is you get the sense of what they're thinking, but also these trends that you hear about. If you're an avid reader of these things about, manpower shortages, like you just talked about, but what that actually looks like for these ones, the guys on the ground, right? You cover that in that sense, right? Talking about who gets wounded and how, and what that does. To me, it's such a striking part of this battle. And it is reminiscent of Normandy, But here it's getting worse because there's less. And I mean, we can talk about the battle and everything that comes after. But to me, that's something that if you don't know too much about this, you get that sense of this isn't good. And that's part of the way you've talked about this battle already, of just how terrible it is. And also something that was striking to me too is, forgot just to go back a minute, is for Black Friday, the number of dead is actually higher than Very Ridge, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's correct. Yeah,
which I think that's a big one, right? I mean, obviously, a lot of the wounded in Normandy there didn't come back, but number of dead is just is so striking for what happened. But anyway, yeah. So that's just something that kind of made me think about. But anyway, we can keep moving and go back to that bigger map.
Yeah. And I think another point that has to be made about the Scheldt Estuary battle is always looking at what was the weather situation there as well. Yes. The rains were unusually heavy for this time for fall of September, October 1944. We're seeing a heavier rainfall rates than normal. We're heading into what will be the worst winter in 50 years in Europe. Nobody knows that at the time, but this is what's starting to develop. And so you've got, the Germans have blown all of the dikes and flooded the polders. And then you have the rain. And that rain is almost pretty constant. You look at the war diaries and the intelligence officer always puts down, what the weather conditions were that day. Well, it's usually rain, more rain. They actually start even, sometimes it's that, the wartime sense of humor. It's like, what would we expect? More rain, So you're seeing that. So, it's the conditions you're fighting in, combined with shortages of manpower, combined with a very stoic and determined German resistance. There's not much good that you can work with here. Everything is really against you, and that's really that's where I ended up with it being the terrible victory over and over again. Because
there was some talk earlier on. Sorry, Alex made funny comments we've been talking about for a couple of days. Sorry, it's about what the veterans remember. Maybe this is a good point to talk about this. Sorry, hold on. There's some really good questions. I'm loving the extra comments today. It's hard to find everything. It's amazing, no. But talking about, I can remember the best I can, is that they don't remember, the veterans themselves, those who fought through it and lived through it, they remember the difficulty of it, but they don't remember the specific details.
Yes. And I actually ran.
This is what I was looking for. Yeah.
And that's actually true. We were lucky at this point that I was able to interview quite a lot of veterans of the Scheldt Estuary. If anyone's been reading my book's chronology, you get to, my most latest book. I was able to interview 2 veterans for that book. Everyone else who could have contributed has either passed away or wasn't able, due to health reasons, to contribute. It's different with the Scheldt Estuary. A lot of them are coming in and giving me stories. Some were pretty good, pretty poignant, but the majority of them, it's like you say, they said, I just remember being cold, wet, miserable, and never knowing when I was going to get hit, because everyone around me was getting hit. Yeah. And you see that where people are definitely, there's not much optimism amongst the soldiers anymore. They figure, it's almost inevitable that they're going to get hit. When the young guys come in as replacements, they don't want to know them. They don't want to. They don't talk to them, because they figure this kid, he's got no experience. He's going to be dead in the next day or two. He's going to make a critical mistake. Cecil Law, who was the South Saskatchewan Regiment's officer, wrote to me about, he gets one of these kids in his unit that day. He's a platoon commander. They're crawling up a ditch. He looks behind him. The kid's crawling behind him. He's got his rifle pointed straight at Cecil. And he looks, and the safety is off. The gun is cocked and ready. All this kid has to do is just touch the trigger, and Cecil's going to get a 303 round in his butt. And he's just sort of saying, I think he takes the gun away from him. I remember what it was.
You were saying in the book, he just has kind of, because again, they're that's part of this is they're crawling towards an enemy position, and he kind of just snaps as much as you can snap in that situation without getting killed.
Yeah.
For the Germans, when you're trying to not get killed by the reinforcement, but yeah, he just like takes it away from him and then has to teach him what to do because he doesn't have basic skills. Yeah, we were talking about this earlier with the manpower, but the idea that. And they call it combing out the units, right? The rear echelon units to get able-bodied soldiers to the front line, and that causes all kinds of problems.
Well, yeah, because your cooks and your truck drivers and stuff, they had basic training back in 1941 and 42 in Aldershot, but by the time they are brought up to the front, how much of that do you remember? Of that training? You've been driving a truck, you've been cooking, you've been moving stores around or something like that. It's a whole nother learning curve to be in combat again. And well, you've never been in combat, but your combat training is kind of far behind you. And it's a different battle, but in the Battle of Ortona, I remember this one sergeant saying to me, they sent in these young guys who had come in from the rear, and he's actually having to show them how to arm a Type 36 grenade while they're under fire, because they don't remember, they learned it, but then they forgot it. And so he's training them in Ortona under fire. And I imagine that kind of thing was happening in the Scheldt as well.
Oh yeah, it definitely feels that again, yeah, this is a bit off topic, but again, probably everyone thinks I'm always trying to make everything about Hong Kong, but it's the same, right? Yes, earlier, and there's the same, but it's so interesting to hear that this same issue is happening all the way from 1941 to the first Canadian battle, sustained battle, the war, to almost towards the end. You're having the same issues. People don't know how to arm a grenade, or they think they do, they tell you they do, and when it comes to you need it, they don't do it properly, or something like that. So it's just that I've read that in Hong Kong, I've read that in the Scheldt. I mean, it's so striking to me that if this sort of same issue keeps coming up. But anyway, I'm sure we could talk about this for the end of time. But anyway, I do want to get moving. So I want to talk about next. I want to kind of parcel it off because I don't want to run too much over. But I'm sure everyone's liking this. But the Breskin's pocket is kind of where I'd like to move next, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so that's Operation Switchback, and this one, once we get the landings, and fortunately the Germans, they did not anticipate the amphibious operation coming in from the east that 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade launches. So the landings at Hoofdplaat are not that heavily resisted, but the movement forward, it seems like we're moving pretty slowly. October 9th, they land. October 15th, you can see they just reached Drywagen and the Eisendyke area. So, the progress was slow. Was slow because, again, it's all polder country. The Germans are on one side of the polder and dug into a dike. The only way the Highland Light Infantry and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Stormont Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders can get at them is they have to go across that flooded polder under fire. Similar situation to what the Black Watch faced, and then wiggle them out of that dike. The Germans generally, just before they get overrun, they up stakes and they flee and they go to the next polder and they set up again. So they can do this again and again and again, and that's what they do. So it takes until October 24th, really, for the Breskin's pocket south side of the Scheldt to be taken.
Yeah.
And then we have this weird situation where the Germans are retreating south, and we're chasing them down towards the Knock and that sort of area. So they're out of the battle as far as the Scheldt Estuary goes, but they still have to be pushed back and finally pinched out to eliminate the pocket that exists there. And that takes until November 2nd. For that to develop. So 3rd Division is completely engaged for that entire time, clearing the Breskens pocket. So you get that side cleared and the pocket, and you've got the south of the estuary cleared, but you still have the other side of the estuary in German hands. And Sheldrake 6's point of 1-to-1 assaults, that's a really good one. And the Germans had enormous resources in artillery, because they had all the artillery on Walcheren Island that could fire across the estuary into the Canadian lines. And you're right. Sheldrake made the point of, careful advance saves lives, and that was what they did. I should also mention that, the brigadier of 3rd Division was commanded by General Spry at that time, and he was a good general. He was also, he really, really valued the importance of keeping his men alive. And so he takes a very, what Simmons considers too safe a way of approaching.
Right.
And, Spry will be replaced by Simmons at the end of this campaign, and I think unfairly. I think he handled his men and his units very well. I think he was a good general, and Simmons's impatience was unwarranted. But Simmons was a bit of a prima donna. I say that.
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm probably actually being kind. And yeah. he didn't inspire a lot of the people who served under him. They either respected him for how tough he was, or they didn't like him. Or I shouldn't say tough, how cold he was. He kept himself very separate from everyone. And in that way, he almost, in a sense, was kind of mirroring Montgomery a bit, because although Monty was very popular with the troops, he kept himself quite aloof. Yes, Alex, you're right. Without the PR effort, Monty Jr. Without the PR effort, very good little.
He should have had more circlips around his jeeps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he would never. You can never imagine Simmons standing on top of a jeep and making a speech to the troops. That's beyond imagining. It just would never have happened. So
it's nonsense.
So we see he had a tendency, when things didn't really reflect well on him, to look for scapegoats, and Spry becomes a scapegoat. You look at Operation Spring in Normandy. His report after that is, I did everything right. It was the guys underneath me who failed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's convenient when people are dead. They can't come back and defend themselves, which is a harsh way of putting it. But there's some truth to this.
That's true. But we talked about Very with Keith about the Black Watch on the channel. But it's it's a trend you see. Again, for those non-Canadians watching, it's not just a Canadian thing. Everybody kind of does this. Canadians do it to each other. Brits do it to Canadians. Canadians do it to Brits. I mean, it's a thing. It was part of my dissertation. I can't not notice it now, but it's just an interesting way of looking at it. And I think Spry doesn't get a good I think he's one of those Canadian generals who doesn't get a proper look at because of such things. But anyway, there is a dissertation about him, which is wonderful. I can link it later, but it's really interesting. And he's one of the commanders that I think doesn't get enough attention. But anyway, yeah, we're getting a bit off topic there. But I think your point about Simmons in this particular campaign are really interesting. And now, again, just to kind of keep moving, I want to go to what I call it, like the final part of this is the well, you know what I'm about to say, but
So if we switch over to Walcheren, Simmons is another moment for Simmons. A big decision had to be made. Walcheren's incredibly heavily defended, but it has an Achilles heel. There's large dikes that go all the way around that island, and if you blow holes in those dikes, you flood the island, except for Middelburg, where it's a little bit of high ground there. And that means all of the German units that are on Walcheren are isolated into their own little forts where they happen to be. And so that's what Simmons decides to do. It's a very controversial decision because it does mean flooding the island, and it means the death of quite a lot of Dutch civilians who are drowned, effectively. And that there's nothing that can be done to really prevent that. They drop pamphlets on the islands telling people to go to high ground and get away from the coast. There is no high ground. There's nowhere to go. And they tell them to get off the island. Well, that's not possible either. So they're stuck. There's nothing they can do. A lot of them do get killed and drowned, or do manage to reach Middelburg and take shelter there. And meanwhile, our way in for the Canadians is across the Walcheren Causeway. Now, this is a railroad track and road access point to connect South Beveland to the island of Walcheren. And it falls to the Canadians again, the Black Watch, which we've talked about, having been hit hard, the Calgary Highlanders, and the Regiment de Maisonneuve, to try and open this up. The commanders at the brigade level and battalion level are not very confident that they can do this, and with good reason, because the causeway is a perfect killing field. I did a presentation for the Calgary Highlanders some years ago where I called it the perfect killing field, and that is, and basically they are running across this causeway. The causeway itself at that time is only about 30 feet wide. It's now, when you drive across it, it's much wider. You're unaware of being on a causeway. So there's the railway, and then there's the road. The Germans have strung barbed wire all over the place, and mines and everything. They have anti-tank guns, including 88s on the other side, aiming straight down. These are
actually 88s, not just I'm assuming they're 88s. We know they're 88s.
No, the one Calgary Highlander, in his accounts, he's like, they're moving forward, and they hit the ground, and there's an 88 shell comes down, it hits the railway, one of the steel tracks, and starts pinwheeling over his head. And he's actually looking up, and he can see this big shell just going like this past him, and it explodes back to further, and kills a bunch of guys. And they were just raked by machine gun fire. And remarkably, they got to the other side and did establish a small bridgehead, but they can't hold it. It's not sustainable. So they have to pull back. That's a good photo. I love that one. Because it gives you a good idea of kind of what they were headed towards. And, at this point, you're not even dealing with crack troops. The garrison that was defending Walcheren is not a crack unit by any means. But they don't have to be, because all they have to do is just sit behind their machine guns and keep firing. They don't have to maneuver. They don't have to do any of that. And so at the same time as we're trying to get across the causeway, the British commandos are landing at Vlissingen and then to the east, or the west, sorry, to establish beachheads and start pushing into Walcheren. And that operation does succeed. And there's some debate, and it's hard to say for certain. This is a good example that you can see how you can see how narrow the causeway is at that point, and that's a pretty accurate depiction of what it looked like from everything I've read, and what the soldiers have told me of what they went into. The only difference being they probably weren't wearing their berets. They probably had the helmets on, but it looks good. And so there has been this debate that the causeway was designed to pin down those German troops so that they couldn't go and contest the commando amphibious operations, which is a Sheldrake 6's point that's just coming forward. And so it seems that that might have been a part of it for sure. But again, you can't prove this stuff beyond, nobody put this in writing anywhere, that this was what was going to happen. And yes, the commanders did want more time. They wanted to do it in a more professional manner, if you will. But it was thrown together very ad hoc and put in a piecemeal kind of manner. If it had been supported by an amphibious landing immediately to its southwest or southeast, it might have had more success, because the British do that in the subsequent, when the causeway attack fails. They don't try and go across the causeway. They come in with buffaloes and land to its flank, and that operation is successful. But by that time, the commandos have also landed, and the pressure's starting to come off. Somebody
brought up here, so there's the Lowland Division shout out that I said was going to happen. I'm not going to avoid it, but so sorry. One question I do. Do we know who does this painting is by, or?
No, it comes from the Calgary Highlanders. They provided that to me. And I think it's a working sketch for another one, which is a black and white that I sent you, that is now the one they use, the Highlanders use in their own museum. That one.
This one, I've seen this one many times,
And so this one is actually even more, it's much more accurate and captures really the reality of the attack. They're about midway up the causeway at this point, and you can see how heavily the fighting is, and the amount of casualties they've already taken.
And you can see the hole blown in the causeway.
That's right. There was the big crater that the Germans had blown into the causeway, which prevented any tank support. Not that tanks would have done much use in there anyway. And that's the other thing, is tanks in the Scheldt Estuary do not play a major role in the fighting, because they just can't operate, except for 4th Armored Division, which is over, as I said, out of the Polder country in Woos Plantage area. They can do a little bit more there. But in the 2nd Division, 3rd Division, and 1st Polish Armored Division zones, not much can happen with the tanks. They just can't play a major role. So that's right. So it's
simple as that, really, to be honest.
So it's an infantryman's battle, and as such, we emerge from this battle with a huge shortage of infantry. The infantry crisis is never resolved after this. We can't. You see at the end of this where platoons are down to 20 men instead of the 100 and some that they should be. you see privates actually commanding platoons because the officers, sergeants, corporals, and everyone are gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something you're going to recover from in any way. And they all recover and work their way up to close to strength again. But again, that's only done by bringing in everybody you can draw from anywhere you can find them. Fortunately, they were able to wind down some of the anti-aircraft regiments and take those troops and throw them into the infantry. Again, guys who had forgotten how they were their rifle and Bren gun and mortar training or all of that stuff. You can get your cooks, your drivers. You can't really take away stretcher bearers because you're running them around like crazy. Just a lot of people are stripped out of the rear and moved forward. And 1st Canadian Army just really never recovers from this until we bring 1st Canadian Corps up from Italy and feed them in to now stand alongside 2nd Canadian Corps. And I should mention, of course, 1st British Corps has been playing the role of 1st Canadian Corps since Normandy onward. So it's interesting with the 1st British Corps is they become, for the British Army, they become a kind of a forgotten, orphaned corps because they're over serving with 1st Canadian Army. And so those regiments and divisions that served in 1st Canadian Corps, you go and look, and a lot of them don't have the same kind of regimental histories that the rest of the British Army coming out of the Second World War often had, which is unfortunate because we don't have then that good record there. The war diaries are pretty good, but it would be nice to have seen the more regimental histories and stuff produced as well.
Yeah, they'll only get you so far. So that's great. We talked about the causeway, which is unavoidable, but there's a couple of things I wanted to touch on. One, I was going to ask this, but then the causeway came up, and I didn't want to. For obvious reasons, the air support part of this is constantly talked about. It's been talked about in the sidebar. It's a big part of ending the campaign, or even starting it, I guess. It's again, this battle is so confusing sometimes. The chronology is not the best way to think about it, but in terms of bombing, like you mentioned, bombing the dikes to flood the island. Also, but there's tons of debate about air power resources not being given to 1st Canadian Army. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit and kind of what that looked like.
Well, there's some truth to this. By that point, there's actual reports from RAF Bomber Command that are saying the Canadians have become bomb happy. And this comes out of Normandy. And then out of the Channel Ports campaign, that whenever we got into a tough situation, we turned to and called for RAF to come in and bomb. It was easier in the Channel Ports because you can just say, well, bomb balloon. It's a big fat target that the tactical bombers or strategic bombing can hit with some reasonable chance of success. Here, you're too close to each other, and then the tactical air, the Typhoons and Spitfires and that are here. They are available, but if you look at the number of days they're able to fly, it's pretty low. Again, the weather is the biggest problem. They have to get in close and personal, really, to do that kind of bombing that they do with rockets and most of the time they're just not able to fly. So again, and when we see this again and again, where the weather and the ability of aircraft in 1944 or 1945 to operate in adverse weather, rain, is curtailed. Nowadays wouldn't be such a big issue, but
Oh, yeah, just sorry. I wanted to make sure the air power we
Mhm.
talked about because it's been discussed. Social media things have been talking about
Yeah.
this for the last couple of while. I know Alex Black is watching. Want to make sure that we get that air power shout out. So I want to make him happy and about getting it
Yeah.
good, right? Because he rightfully so is talking about it's limited. There's that comment from Portal about morale and all of that and whatever. But again, he's right. There is instances where it does help the morale.
Oh yeah.
Good support about this. I mean, Normandy is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to air support, but
well, yeah, the close-up air support was very welcome. The strategic bombers going over and bombing us didn't go over so well, and that happened in Normandy twice. So that was always a concern, and you couldn't in the Scheldt Estuary have used like Lancasters and that sort of thing. They were fine for busting the Walcheren dike system, but that was, there was no close, nobody was fighting close at that time. They could miss all they wanted, and all they had to do was have a couple bombs hit, and you've done your work.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point to remember, because that's part of the Allied doctrine, obviously. And again, we don't really, because we're running low, and I don't want to keep people too much longer, because there's two other things I want to talk about. So one, just real quick, we talked about how this is the battle that really strips the strength, zaps the strength of First Canadian Army, and you say they didn't really build up back. This is where conscription comes in. That's a huge part of Canada's war effort. I mean, it's not. Again, this is a whole other thing. I think it's handled so much better in the Second World War than it is in the First. But that is another hugely political, almost divisive thing that happens. And it's interesting, too, because I've done some looking into this for numerous other things. And we're talking about the level of training earlier. The conscripts are better trained because they've been there longer. They've been training for years. So I think that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Again, too, you write about after, and there's the whole, the salient at Nijmegen and everything, but that's not what we're talking about now. So the one thing, sorry, I just wanted to throw that out there real quick. We can probably have you on to talk about that another time.
Sure.
It's worth its own talk, its own story. Again, another area that doesn't get the attention it deserves. Now, me and Mark were chatting about this real quick before we started. It's probably what brought some of you here to watch today, is the Forgotten Battle film. It's a lot of hatred out there for this one. I'm just saying that outright. I mean, there's a lot going on. But Mark, you told me you haven't seen it.
No, that's true. I've got to get on Netflix so I can see it.
I mean, and I have watched it. Yeah, it's problematic. It didn't upset me that much. I mean, some people are really, really outright pissed off because the Canadians have such a small part in this battle that's called the Forgotten Battle of the Scheldt, and that really upset a lot of people. Yeah, so at this point, basically talking about how the causeway is outflanked because two girls in the resistance bring a map that no one's ever heard of before, apparently, and then they use the Highland Division uses it to come around and they take the causeway. Is basically what happens. So because you said you hadn't seen it, and part of your book at the end, rightfully placed, talks about how this battle is remembered or how it's not remembered. And that was obviously well before this movie came out. So that's kind of where I think a good point to kind of end here is talking about this battle and why it's not remembered and what this movie might do in terms of remembering it.
I think the movie is actually interesting, and I do want to see it because
I do recommend you watch it. Yeah,
it's the most expensive film that the Dutch have ever done.
Yeah, second most expensive.
Second most. Okay, and interesting that they picked the Scheldt to be the one to focus on because, of course, the big happy story for the Dutch is the liberation, and usually, that's really what the Dutch often, you go to Holland, that's what most people want to talk about is liberation. Even when you get down in the Scheldt area, it's sort of like people are talking about the liberation. They weren't even actually they were liberated in very different circumstances, and much harsher than elsewhere. But that's what really resonates with the Dutch more. So it was interesting to see them take this tact with the movie to focus on this. At the same time, it does seem the Scheldt Estuary is becoming more something that the Dutch are studying and paying attention to. I've had a couple invitations that were thwarted by COVID from Dutch battle schools, their military, to come and that they're using the Scheldt Estuary as a study ground now for their military. In Canada, I think it got pushed to the background, I think, a lot because of the veterans themselves not wanting to talk about it. So not that the veterans talked about much when they came home, but this is even less. So it wasn't part of any cultural remembrance in Canada.
Yeah, okay, I guess that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And when you do that, things it goes long enough, things drop off to the point that it's a real struggle to bring them back into the memory. And we've mentioned the Rhineland Campaign is another one that basically just is gone from the cultural lexicon. You go from Normandy to the liberation of Holland, and something happened in between. But what the heck was that?
A little bit of land in between those two spots as it is, so something happened.
Yeah. And so I think what's really important, what I've been stressing, and I do this as well through battlefield tours when we go and is getting people into those areas where they can see the ground, get to the cemeteries, see the costs that were suffered. That changes the picture. Even if you've only got 50 people, those 50 people go back to Canada and have that story now that they will spread, and that. I like to think it all begins the snowball effect, and I think we are seeing that. I think what we're seeing is people realizing that it's not enough to know one or two iconic moments in Canadian World War II history, that you do need to understand. If you want to know what the experience of your grandfathers, your great-grandfathers, great-uncles was in the war, you have to kind of know everything that, at least the division they were involved in. Where did they go? What was their experience? And then out of that, you'll get a much deeper appreciation of what those relatives went through in World War II, and understand why that war left such an their experience of war left such an indelible impression on them for the rest of their lives. And to me, that's where I'm always trying to get people. And even if you don't have relatives, get the average Canadian even to have that understanding, because it puts into context. We often look at these, especially my generation, we grew up with these kind of elderly fellows in their Legion uniforms. At November 11th, they all came out and they walked down the street, and you thought, well, that was, they had quite an experience, and had no idea what that experience was, because in the 1960s, people didn't study this much.
Right.
I think it's fortunate today. There seems to be more awareness of what that generation went through than when I was a kid growing up. So I think that's good.
I think it's great, and I mean, I can only speak for. I grew up in the '90s, so there's diminishing numbers of veterans, but people were starting to seemingly talk about more, as you and me were just kind of chatting about at the beginning. But it is. I think this is a perfect example of what we were just saying, of remembering and what that means, what the conditions are like, what they had to do. I think the Scheldt is a perfect example of that. And I'm not knocking Normandy or people who focus on Normandy, because I know myself, not at all. But it's just we got to look a little broader and a little deeper. And I think this is a good way to do that. And just kind of like a final sort of thing here is, and I think you're going to agree with such a statement, is it's the Canadian Army's most important battle in the war.
I think so, because they open up the port of Antwerp. They don't get invited to the opening, but what the heck? Monty and everybody. But yes, the opening up of the Antwerp port is huge, because it breaks that supply problem neck. We're not having to bring things up from Normandy anymore. It can flood in from there, and you see it with Hitler's launch of the V1, V2 attacks on Antwerp. He was always, and the whole Battle of the Bulge. Its purpose was to try and get back and capture Antwerp. So the Germans realize they're losing the war because of Antwerp opening up, and they just can't stop it. It's really what happens.
Yeah, so it's I think that says it all right there. Is for those who don't know much about the Canadian story, some people are watching here, they're learning this stuff the first time or in depth for the first time. Is think about the bulge. Where's that heading, or where is it supposed to head? I mean, it doesn't come close. But what were they trying to do? Why is that important? So I think that's a great way to kind of bring people who don't know Canadian military history and are starting to get interested, I think, just from my own perspective. And again, I do this every day. But anyway, it sounds like it's a good way to do this. And it's such great to have people like you being able to talk about this stuff at such length. I mean, your book, like I said earlier, is great. If you haven't read it, there's links in the description below to buy it, check it out, along with some of Mark's other books that will hopefully have him on to talk about, because there's just so much part of this, as you said, the long left flank, that doesn't get enough attention that definitely should. So I think you've done a great job there, but we can do that another time. So
sure.
I'm just going to do a quick wrap up, and then we'll come back and then we'll shut her down. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Brad.
Yeah, I'll have you back in a second here. Just give me 1 second. So thanks everyone for watching. This was a really great show. Hope you enjoyed it. I was really excited to have this one. Having Mark on was amazing. Reading his books is great. Again, like I said, links in the description below for his books, different locations depending on where you are, US, UK, Canada. There's some different options there. Also, if you're a fan of this stuff and what I do in my work and the channel, please support me on Patreon if you are able. That really helps me to keep doing this. I won't be able to do so without it. I'm getting more and more support all the time, but I still need a lot more. Also, there's a link to buy me a coffee if you just want to do it one quick time $5 thing. That would be also amazing. Also, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do. And like the video too. These two things might just seem very small, but they're hugely helpful for me to keep doing this. So if you can do that, please, it takes a few seconds, just please do. Really, 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 really helps me. So if you can do, please, 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 please do. I know it sounds a bit beggy, but I gotta ask. So anyway, so thanks again, Mark. Everyone is sending all greats of nice comments. It's great to see the support that everyone's kind of giving for me and these stories, and allowing me to have people who know this stuff like you on here. So I think it's great. Did you like coming on the show? Was it enjoyable for you? Oh, sorry, I got you muted here.
I'm muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
It's on me. It's on me. Everybody.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed the show very much. There's a lot of good commentary from and questions from other people coming across. That was kind of cool. I don't. This is one of the few times I've done a live one. Usually these kind of things are recorded, so it was it's kind of dynamic in a way that the recorded ones aren't. So I like it. I like it. Yeah,
I like the dynamism. It's fun, and I like getting people involved. I like hearing what people have to say. So this is the perfect one for it. So
I agree.
So anyway, everyone, thanks for watching. Sorry we went a bit over time there, but this is an important topic and everyone's interested. So I've got another live stream coming up next week about, again, the Battle of the Scheldt with Stephen Fisher, about Operation Infatuate that was talked about a bit, and the landing. So look out for that. I'll be doing that. It's already been on social media, but I'll be doing more coming up. So everyone look out for that. Everyone else, thanks again for watching. Then thanks for supporting the channel, and we will see you next time.